Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Ridgway History. So today what we're going to be looking at is TR, Teddy Roosevelt, the one and only. And so in this lesson here for you, for DCUSH specifically, we're going to be taking a look at really what makes TR the person he is, because he is probably a president that deserves some special attention, and then also kind of his rise and his motivations that leads to him eventually becoming president, and then also his attempt in 1912 to run as a progressive candidate. Okay, so again, our specific objectives here: summarize his ascension to the presidency, his approach to domestic affairs, and we're going to look at something called conservative progressivism. Okay, and then the motivations for each candidate in the 1912 election in the context of the progressive movement. Okay, so to get us started off here, to look at how TR became president, I'm going to very briefly just kind of go through the story map here. I'm not going to go to it to the depth that I would like you to do, okay, because I think that you're wholly capable of doing that on your own. Okay, but we're going to talk about how does this guy become president. It's actually pretty straightforward. So when Teddy Roosevelt is born, he's actually born into a pretty nice, really comfy family in terms of his background. So he kind of is informed by a whole bunch of things in his childhood that will also then go on to translate to him being president and those kind of things. And so as it says here, he's a sickly, scrawny boy with poor eyesight and chronic asthma, but he did build himself up very physically, to be very physically fit and then also mentally strong. And he does eventually come to call this the strenuous life, to pursue being basically physically very, very fit, and then as well to kind of be sharp, not necessarily spiritually, but intellectually to be very sharp as well. So as his life goes on, there's whole things in here you can see from his life. He kind of retreats from society after his wife and child die. I believe it was his child. Go double check here. Yep. No, it's his mother and his wife, excuse me. So both of those things, after his wife gives birth to a baby girl, he kind of retreats to society for a while. And when he comes back to New York in 1886, this is really where we start to see TR get his rise. So he campaigns hard at first for the presidency of William McKinley, tries to apply for a post, and instead he goes off and fights in the Spanish-American War. You'll see that when we talk about the Spanish-American War here in the next class. Okay, he kind of becomes this like mythological figure from it. And now McKinley, who had previously turned him down for a post in his last presidency, this time actually makes him his vice president. Okay, and then when McKinley wins in 1900, that's when he then gets assassinated afterwards. And that is actually how we get. And again, the story map is actually going to stop here because, again, when McKinley gets assassinated was a person who was kind of upset about the spoils system and how jobs were being handed out by McKinley, that is when TR will then become president. Okay, so there, his path to the presidency. Okay, I'm actually going to then very briefly here, the thing you'll need to do next is kind of reflect. I'm going to skip that because, again, I'm just focusing on the content here. Okay, so approach to domestic affairs by analyzing conservative progressivism. He says he's often called a conservative progressive. Do his domestic policies measure up? Okay, so this I'm actually not going to take you through step by step. I think you're wholly capable of clicking on buttons and then doing the reflection at the end. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click this one thing at the very end just to use it as kind of a way to summarize what is a conservative progressive. Okay, it says, so Roosevelt's progressivism. While most progressive initiatives originate at the state and local levels, national reform efforts emerged around 1900. Okay, and so here we go. Here's our summary. More than any other president since Abraham Lincoln, Roosevelt possessed an activist bent. Still, his initial approach to reform was cautious. He sought to avoid the extremes of socialism on one hand and laissez-faire individualism on the other. Okay, so when you're reforming, there's basically, and in how you reform society generally, is you can have, well, we need to completely restructure society, which is kind of more of a socialist approach, and then the laissez-faire individualism is like, no, we're all on our own, it's you out there trying to fight against the world, and he's kind of trying to go between these two extremes. Okay, so it says he greatly expanded the role and visibility of the presidency as well as the authority of the federal government. Okay, and so he cultivated party leaders in Congress and steered away from divisive issues. And when he did approach the exploitive issues of regulating the trusts, he took care to reassure the business community. So for him, politics was the art of the possible. Unlike the more radical progressives and doctrinaire lunatic fringe, as he called it, he would take half a loaf rather than none at all. And so this is why we can call him maybe perhaps a conservative progressive, because he's not trying to, for example, when it comes to the national parks, he's not trying to protect the land and that the land will never ever be touched ever again. Okay, it's that he's trying to conserve it in some cases for later. Hence, we can kind of come from that name, conservative progressivism. He's not trying to do things super radically, but he is trying to make change where he sees that he can do so. Okay, now this will kind of change a little bit here when we talk about the election of 1912. Okay, which is going to be our next topic. And our motivations here, if you can see that for TR, this is drastically shifted during the time of his presidency. Okay, so the motivations for each candidate in the 1912 election, and that is because there were 4 candidates running for the presidency in 1912. Okay, so this is going to be our main mini lesson, what we're going to focus on. Okay, so we're going to look at how do politics correspond to the attitudes and perceptions of voters, and then also we're going to look at third parties, and that is because, as you'll see here, TR is going to probably create what was the most successful third party chance to ever become president really happen. Alrighty, so it's a 4-part biography here. Alrighty, so our first candidate is this gentleman right here. His name is Eugene V. Debs. We've talked about him before. Okay, he is an Indiana Hoosier. If you remember, he was the one that led the very unsuccessful Pullman strike, okay, back in 1894. Now, after that time, he was imprisoned, goes, really during this time, reads a whole bunch of Marx and other communist-inspired works. I would also tell you to click at this link. If you do not know what communism is, I will introduce you to a very brief introduction of communism here. Okay, it's also available as another video on the channel. Okay, but anyways, the Socialist Party had started to become more popular, not only due to him, but then also because of industrialization and all of the big kind of like capitalism kind of excesses that happen with it. And so when he becomes a candidate for the Socialist Party in 1912, a bit of a spoiler, he doesn't win. However, he gets 6% of the vote, nearly 1 million votes when 1912 rolls around. And so he will basically become not only one of the more successful, I think, third parties that's out there, but certainly one of the more radical that's ever been that successful. Okay, and you can see him here when he gets older. A few more wrinkles. Okay, so our second candidate is this guy right here, and it is Woodrow Wilson. Okay, now you may not know a lot about Woodrow Wilson at this point, okay, but he is known for a couple of things. Number one, probably being extremely learned and very, as it says there, bookish. He was quite the nerd. And in fact, I've sat down and I've actually taken some time to look at Woodrow Wilson's writing. He was so focused on learning and things of that nature that he actually, in order to take notes and to be more successful in classes and lectures and during his time at Princeton and those kind of ventures, he actually invented his own handwriting system, which I would tell you to Google and see if you can actually understand it, because it's pretty crazy. But he was an extremely unpopular president of Princeton. He's actually just about to lose his job there when he's nominated to be the governor of New Jersey. Okay, his plan is based on progressivism because, again, that's the language of the day. And it was something called New Freedom. Okay, so what was it? Lower tariffs, limited federal government, antitrust laws, and then also to have a new banking regulator called the Federal Reserve System. Now again, he sees himself as a progressive. He is the Democratic candidate for president. Okay, but there, you'll notice in here there's like limited federal government even though you are progressive, which is kind of, I guess in some senses, opposite of what a progressive would espouse, right? Because they're going to use something called positive statism, using the power of the state to make change happen. Okay, so that's kind of his big thing. Again, it's his progressive plan called New Freedom. And it's all these things right here. You want to make sure that you know them. Okay, yes, and there's him when he gets a little bit older and after he's had his stroke, which kind of, you can see there on that side of his face, is kind of paralyzed his face and it's kind of drooping a little bit. Alrighty. So, candidate number 3. This guy had actually just been president in 1908. He was Roosevelt's handpicked successor after Roosevelt served his 2 terms as president. He's actually, Roosevelt has kind of this kind of myth built up about him as a trust buster, even though Taft does bust more trusts than TR did. Okay, so he did do a whole lot of progressive things that Roosevelt liked. He really was Roosevelt's really the person who Roosevelt wanted to follow him as the president. Now the thing is that why we have to bring up how Taft's relationship with Roosevelt kind of developed as time went on is that the two basically had a falling out, although they did kind of rekindle their relationship later. And that is because Taft approached essentially progressivism in a very different manner than Roosevelt eventually came to solve progressivism. It was more pro-business, there was less government action, and also, at least what historians seem to think now, is that Taft was much more easily influenced by the people around him than Roosevelt would have liked. Okay. Ultimately, kind of what broke the camel's back for their relationship with Roosevelt is that he fired Gifford Pinchot, which was basically TR's best friend, and he worked in the forestry department. And this causes a whole big scandal called the Ballinger-Pinchot scandal, which Taft tries to basically then fire Pinchot, and it gets really, really messy. It's very nasty. Now Taft, if you do not know much about him, he is a big boy. He's extremely fat and liked golf, as you can see right there. He actually did, it is true, have a tub that basically fit 3 grown men in it normally, but only fit him because he was that big. Okay, big dude. Spent his time mostly on golf courses if he could choose so. Okay, which then brings us to candidate number 4. And you're like, wait, TR's already served 2 terms. No, he comes back again in 1912 to run as a third party. Okay, because again, Taft is running as a Republican, which is what Roosevelt was before. Eugene V. Debs is running as a socialist, and we have Woodrow Wilson running as a Democrat. And so TR knows essentially that, and kind of how the party works in the background is that TR gets denied being the Republican candidate. So he's like, screw it, I will go and make my own party, and that is the Bullmooser Party. And again, this is because he's had this falling out with Taft that he sees that, or at least in TR's mind, that Taft has betrayed the principles of progressivism which he had picked him for. And so when he starts basically organizing this party, it is remarkably successful in terms of getting support, as you'll see here in a second. His plan was called, in this election, New Nationalism. And in this case, TR from the past has shifted to become even more progressive and perhaps you could say left-leaning. A very powerful federal government to regulate the economy and to provide social justice. Okay? And again, this is called New Nationalism. So we have New Freedom for Woodrow Wilson, and we have New Nationalism for Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, now the results. Okay, well, actually, I should mention this here. I did put this picture in, and I almost forgot to. I'm glad this popped up. So TR is extremely determined to run in this election. So determined, in fact, that during one of his speeches, he gets shot, and he goes ahead and finishes the speech anyways before he goes to the hospital. And you can see actually the bullet here of the x-ray from Roosevelt, and the bullet's right here in his rib where it got lodged. So interesting story. Yes, he's an extremely determined man, and he will, after this election, the bullet, along with a couple other things, will contribute to kind of cause his death. So, sorry, spoilers. So, the election, what happens? Wilson wins. Okay. Now, this should make sense on face value, and here's why. Okay. So, if we've had 2 candidates, Taft and Roosevelt, who have both been running for the Republican ticket, and they've been competing for votes, that is going to do what we call it splits the party. It splits the vote. And basically, that's bad in an election. You do not want 2 people who are going to take votes away from each other, who would normally attract the same kind of people voting for them. And this is what we get as a result. Okay, so if we look here at the popular vote, okay, Wilson, as the Democratic candidate, gets 42%. Okay, but you put these 2 together, Taft, the Republican in red, and then the green, Roosevelt, that's 50%. Together, their votes would have beaten Wilson, but because they were competing against each other, okay, and you can see the states out here, Taft only wins 2 states, okay, and you can see the green for Roosevelt. Again, that's a third party taking all those votes. You can see that he takes like the two fighting against each other basically dooms any possibility. A divided party is almost certainly going to result in a lost election. That's exactly what happens. And so when Wilson wins, he's he's the third Democrat to be president since Reconstruction. And this certainly shows, if we just look at what we're terming progressivism, okay, as the more progressive candidates of Wilson and Roosevelt, you can see that they're taking up a huge chunk of the electorate together. And so we can say that the voters are more progressive leaning in this election. Okay. The other thing it doesn't show on here is that when Eugene V. Debs takes 6% of the vote, that's here in this minor category, he's also soaking up quite a bit of votes as well. Okay, and we can see that there is now a higher receptivity to socialist ideas. And we're going to come back to that when we talk about some of the Red Scares later. Okay, so other than that, okay, your exit ticket's going to be right here. It'll look a little bit different for you in that time, but hopefully this has been a pretty good comprehensive look at this lesson. Alrighty?